It had been a long shift, the kind that made every bone ache and every muscle scream for rest. The hospital hallways were quieter now, the chaos of the day settling into a lull as the night shift took over. Most of the nurses had already clocked out, eager to escape the fluorescent lights and the weight of responsibility pressing on their shoulders. But Sarah remained. She had told herself she'd only stay for a few extra minutes, just long enough to check in one last time on Mr. Thompson. He was in his 70s, recovering from surgery, and had spent most of the day alone. His family had visited earlier, but they had left hours ago, promising to return in the morning. Sarah had noticed how he stared at the ceiling, his hands fidgeting with the thin hospital blanket, eyes glassy with unspoken worries. She knew that look. It was the look of someone who didn't want to be alone, but didn't want to ask for company either. So instead of heading straight to her car, she turned back toward his room. The hospital bed seemed to swallow him up, making him look smaller, more fragile. His breathing was slow, steady, but there was something in his expression that tugged at Sarah's heart. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, stepping closer. He blinked, startled out of whatever thoughts had trapped him. "Oh, you're still here." His voice was weak, but there was warmth in it. Sarah smiled. "Yeah, I thought I'd check in on you before heading home. How are you feeling?" He sighed, shifting slightly. "I've been better, but I suppose that's to be expected." He paused, then added in a quieter voice, "Nights are the hardest." Sarah understood. There was something about hospitals at night, the way the world outside felt so far away, the way the silence seemed heavier than it should. She pulled up a chair and sat beside his bed. "Do you want me to stay for a little while?" His eyes softened, with gratitude, though he didn't say the words out loud. Instead, he just nodded. For the next half hour, Sarah sat with him, listening as he talked about his life. He spoke of his late wife, of the little bookstore they had owned together for nearly 40 years. He talked about his children, how proud he was of them, how he wished he didn't feel like a burden now. Sarah listened, not just out of duty, but because she genuinely cared. She had always believed that nursing wasn't just about medicine. It was about kindness, about showing up when someone needed you most. At one point, he chuckled, shaking his head. "I must be keeping you from getting home. You've had a long day, haven't you?" Sarah shrugged. "It's all right. I don't mind." And she didn't. She stayed until his eyelids grew heavy, until his breathing evened out in sleep. Only then did she quietly slip out of the room, her heart feeling a little fuller despite her exhaustion. What she didn't know was that her small act of kindness wasn't forgotten, and in the days that followed, something completely unexpected was about to happen, something that would change everything. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital, feeling the familiar pull of exhaustion, but she pushed it aside as she made her way through the hallways. She had done this countless times before. Long shifts, little sleep, back again the next day. But something about last night lingered in her mind. She found herself wondering how Mr. Thompson was doing. When she stepped into his room, she was relieved to see him awake, looking a little brighter than he had the night before. He turned his head and smiled at her. "Ah, my guardian angel returns." Sarah chuckled. "I wouldn't go that far, just doing my job." "Well, you didn't have to. Stay with me last night," he said, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity. That meant a lot. Before she could respond, the door swung open, and two people hurried inside. A man and a woman, both in their 30s, their expressions a mixture of concern and relief. "Dad!" The woman rushed to his bedside, gripping his hand. "How are you feeling?" "I'm all right, sweetheart," Mr. Thompson reassured her. "Better than I was." Sarah took a step back, giving them space, but she could still feel the tension in the air. The man, who looked to be in his late 30s, turned to her with a curious expression. "Are you the nurse who stayed with him last night?" She hesitated, before nodding. "Yeah, I just didn't want him to be alone." The woman's eyes softened. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We had no idea he was feeling that way. He doesn't always tell us when something's wrong." Sarah smiled politely. "He's lucky to have family who cares so much." They exchanged a few more words before Sarah excused herself, feeling a strange sense of unease she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't that they were unkind, far from it, but something in their eyes, the way they looked at her, made her feel like there was more to this moment than she understood. Over the next few days, she noticed Mr. Thompson's family visiting more often, staying longer. Each time they saw her, they greeted her warmly, but there was always an undertone of something unspoken. The feeling only grew stronger when one afternoon, Mr. Thompson pulled her aside. "Sarah," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I need to ask you something." She raised an eyebrow. "Of course. What is it?" He hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of the hospital blanket. "What made you stay that night? Nurses are busy. You could have left, but you didn't." "Why?" Sarah thought for a moment. I just didn't want you to feel alone. I've seen too many patients go through nights like that, staring at the ceiling, pretending they're fine. I just thought, if I could make it a little easier, even for one night, then it was worth it." Mr. Thompson's eyes held something unreadable. "That says a lot about you." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the moment passed, and he smiled at her, shifting the conversation to something lighter. But the question stayed with her. Why had she stayed? Was it just instinct? Or was it something deeper? A few more days passed, and Sarah had almost convinced herself that whatever she had felt was just her own overthinking. But then, something unexpected happened. She was finishing up paperwork at the nurse's station when a familiar voice caught her attention. "Sarah?" She looked up to see Mr. Thompson's daughter standing there, looking slightly nervous. "Hey," Sarah said, setting her pen down. "Everything okay?" The woman hesitated before stepping closer. "Actually, my brother and I wanted to talk to you about something. Would you have a few minutes?" Sarah frowned, but nodded. "Sure." They led her into one of the smaller visitor rooms, closing the door behind them. Mr. Thompson's son was already inside, waiting. The air in the room felt different, heavy, charged with something unspoken. Sarah's stomach tightened. "What's going on?" The man exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "We've been trying to find the right time to tell you this, but our dad told us what you did for him. How you stayed, how you listened." His sister nodded. "He said you reminded him of someone really important to him." Sarah blinked. "I did." Their expressions softened. "Our mom," the woman said quietly. "She was a nurse too." Sarah felt her breath hitch. "She passed away a few years ago," the man continued. "And ever since then, our dad hasn't really opened up to anyone like he did with you." He said, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Sarah swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of what to say. The woman took a deep breath. "We wanted to do something to thank you. And, well, it's not just about gratitude. We feel like you've come into our lives for a reason." Sarah's heart pounded. She had no idea what was coming next, but whatever it was about to change everything. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't even considered that her small act of kindness could mean something so much bigger. She looked between the two siblings, their expressions filled with emotion, and she suddenly felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. I don't know what to say," she admitted. You don't have to say anything. Mr. Thompson's son said, "Just hear us out." His sister nodded. "Our dad's been talking about you non-stop. He said that for the first time in years, he felt like someone truly saw him. Not as a patient, not as someone who needed help, but as a person." She hesitated before adding, "That's something our mom used to do for people. And we know if she were here, she'd want us to do this." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "Do what?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of paper. "This," he said, handing it to her. With hesitant fingers, Sarah unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. Her heart pounded as she realized what she was looking at. It was a letter, an official one. "We own our family's old bookstore," the woman explained. "It's been in our family for generations. Our dad and mom ran it together for nearly 40 years. But after she passed, it just wasn't the same. He lost his passion for it. And over time, so did we. But after talking to you," her brother added, "he said he realized something. Life isn't just about holding on to the past. It's about finding people who remind us why we loved something in the first place." Sarah looked up, still confused. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" Their smiles widened. "We want you to have it," the woman said softly. Sarah's breath hitched. "What?" "The bookstore," the man confirmed. "Our dad wants to pass it down to someone who truly understands people, someone who cares. He said he sees that in you." Sarah shook her head, stunned. I'm just a nurse. I don't know anything about running a bookstore." "You don't have to," the woman said. "We'll help you. But more than that, we just want it to go to someone who will take care of it the way our parents did. Someone who sees people the way our mom did." Tears pricked the corners of Sarah's eyes. She had spent years giving everything to her patients, never expecting anything in return. And now, here she was, being offered something she never could have imagined. She glanced down at the letter again, then back at the two people in front of her. "Are you sure?" They nodded. "Completely." A lump formed in Sarah's throat as she realized what this meant. It wasn't just about the bookstore. It was about trust, about family, about a life she had never even considered for herself. She thought about the long nights, the exhaustion, the way she had always given every part of herself to her work. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if there was something more? Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And then, slowly, she smiled. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do this." And just like that, her life changed forever.